Welcome to Anunnaki Sanctuary's channel. Tonight we walk where the river air tastes like damp earth and crushed reeds, where lantern light trembles on slow water, and where your footsteps make that soft, stubborn sound mud always makes when it refuses to let go. You are not rushing, you are drifting, the way a thought drifts when you are almost asleep. And while you drift, you hold a simple question like a warm cup in both hands. What if the oldest Sumerian records, the ones pressed into clay beside the Tigris and Euphrates, are quietly telling a different story about the origin of humanity? Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian cities emerge in this river-fed plain, and archaeology suggests that some of the earliest writing we know of appears here as marks in wet clay. But we are going to keep our footing gentle and safe. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we will use cautious words on purpose. Might, may, could suggests. Historians debate. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your location and your local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a riverbank that does not know it is famous. The mud under your feet is cool and fine, like sifted flour that got itself into trouble. Somewhere nearby, a reed bed shivers, and the sound is almost like whispering paper, except paper is not a thing yet, at least not here. What's broadly accepted is that the people of ancient Sumer write on clay, not because it is poetic, but because it is practical. Clay is everywhere. Clay is patient. Clay does not demand a pen with expensive ink. It just sits there, like a sleepy pet, waiting to be pressed. A scribe is close, hunched in the lamplight, and you can almost hear the reed stylus scratch, that tiny hush-hush sound of wet clay agreeing to remember. Most historians agree that writing in early Mesopotamia begins with administration, lists, counts, rations, deliveries. You can picture it, can't you? The first great leap of human communication being, essentially, we have 19 jars of barley. Please do not pretend we have 20. It's not romantic, but it is honest. And if you feel your eyes drooping, it's comforting in a strange way to imagine the earliest literature of humanity being paperwork. Your ancestors are out here inventing civilization, and also inventing the headache of inventory. Archaeology suggests that these early marks evolve over time, from simple impressions and pictographs into the wedge-shaped cuneiform signs that later scribes used to write myths, prayers, contracts, and royal inscriptions. The evidence we do have points to a long development, not a single lightning bolt moment. So when we ask, what if Sumerian records tell a different origin of humanity? We are not proving anything tonight. We are following clues. We are watching the way a practical tool becomes a mirror. You look down and notice what the scribe is doing. The tablet is small, palm-sized, and the clay is still damp, still alive in a way. There is something tender about that. A careful reading might suggest that a society that records who gets bread, who owes labor, who owns land, is also quietly defining what a person is. Not in a modern philosophical way, but in a day-to-day way. The way you define something by touching it repeatedly. You are a worker because the tablet says you are. You are a child because the ration list counts you as one. You are a member of a household because the sign for your name sits under the sign for someone else's authority. That is interpretation, not certainty. But it's a reasonable interpretation. And once you see it, you can't quite unsee it. Most historians agree that Sumer is not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of city-states, places with names that still feel like they carry dust in their syllables. And what's broadly accepted is that these cities sit in a landscape that demands cooperation, irrigation, canals, labor coordination, shared schedules. Archaeology suggests that as towns grow into cities, new institutions form around temples and administration. The evidence we do have points to complex social organization early on, with specialized work and hierarchies. If you're listening in bed right now, wrapped in a blanket, it's mildly hilarious to realize that a big slice of being human may have always included. Show up on time, do your shift, and hope your boss is in a decent mood. Some things are timeless, sadly, but tonight's question is softer than that. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if, in the clay and the ritual phrases and the repeated lists, there's a different kind of origin story? Not humans appear out of nowhere, but humans become humans in a particular way. That idea stays mostly on mainstream ground. It fits what archaeology suggests about gradual development. It doesn't require secret continents or hidden machines. It just asks you to notice the subtle power of record-keeping. Still, the mist is waiting at the edge of the lantern light, and we will visit it carefully. You move closer to the tablet, and you imagine, gently, how it might feel to live in a world where memory is turning external. Before writing, memory lives in people, in songs, in elders, in ritual repetition. With writing, memory can sit on a shelf. It can outlast the person who spoke it. One interpretation is that this changes the shape of society. Not instantly, but steadily, like a river changing its banks over generations. The evidence we do have points to writing becoming a tool of institutions. And institutions tend to prefer stable stories. So you can wonder, without claiming certainty, whether origin stories begin to harden when they can be stored. And then you notice something else. This little tablet, this humble rectangle of clay, is not just information. It is authority. It says, this is what happened. And even if it is only about barley, it trains everyone nearby to treat marks as reality. That is a big step. Maybe not as dramatic as fire, but arguably more dramatic than your phone's latest software update, which mostly just moves buttons around and calls it progress. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian literature includes multiple creation traditions and many stories about gods and humans. And scholars continue to debate how those myths relate to earlier Sumerian material. Let me rephrase that more carefully, because this is where people sometimes get excited and sprint ahead. The earliest Sumerian records we have are often administrative, and the later mythological texts come from different periods and contexts. That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it's a crucial distinction. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, even early on, you can sense the habit forming, the habit of defining, the habit of categorizing, the habit of making the world fit into signs. You take a slow breath, and the air smells like wet clay and smoke from a small oil lamp. Somewhere behind you, a donkey makes an unimpressed noise, as if to say, Yes, your theories are very interesting, but I'm still carrying these jars. You smile, because the whole scene is both grand and ordinary. That's Mesopotamia for you, world-changing ideas, plus mud on your ankles. Now we step, gently, into the misty part, the part we label properly. A fringe idea proposes that some Sumerian stories, especially those about extraordinary beings or impossibly long reigns, hint at something non-human guiding early civilization. This theory isn't widely accepted, But it shows up in popular culture because it's dramatic and, frankly, because it makes for excellent late-night conversation. A popular rumor claims that the gods in these texts were visitors of some kind, teachers from somewhere else. To be clear, this is debated. And most historians agree that mythic language is not a straightforward historical record. A more cautious explanation could be that divine figures represent forces, institutions, or idealized roles, and that exaggerated numbers are symbolic or ideological. That's the mainstream anchor, but if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can still let your imagination hover. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the origin is not about biology, but about instruction, about being taught how to live in a city, how to measure time, how to obey a calendar, how to make agreements that outlive you? That is an imagined mood, not a claim. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You watch the scribe press the stylus again, and you think about how a small action can echo. Historians still argue whether the earliest writing was primarily a neutral tool for administration or a power instrument that shaped society by shaping what could be recorded. And because we are staying sleep-friendly, we do not need to pick a side tonight. We only need to notice that the question exists. Like a soft pebble in your pocket, the lantern flame dips, and the tablet's surface gleams for a moment. You imagine, quietly, that somewhere in these marks is the first hint of a different origin story. Not humans were made, but humans were organized. Not a single secret truth, but a puzzle, an open question, a debated interpretation. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and as you stand there, listening to reeds and water and the patient scratch of clay being asked to remember, you let a final thought settle in. Slow and warm, if humanity has an origin. It might not be one moment. It might be a habit. It might be a pattern. It might be a story we learn to tell ourselves, one small wedge-shaped mark at a time. You stay near the river a little longer, because the air out here has a way of rinsing the mind clean. The water moves like a slow thought, and the reeds keep making that soft paper-like whisper, even though paper is still, technically, future business. The lantern light behind you flickers, and the scribe's tablet is set aside to dry, quiet proof that something happened, or at least that someone wanted it remembered that way. Most historians agree that as small settlements grow into true cities in southern Mesopotamia, life changes in ways that are both obvious and sneaky. Obvious. There are more people, more buildings, more noise, more smells. Sneaky. Time itself feels different. The evidence we do have points to increasing specialization, administration, and social layers, especially in places often associated with the Uruk period. Archaeology suggests that Uruk becomes one of the earliest and largest urban centers we know of. With monumental buildings and evidence of complex organization, that's the documented ground beneath your feet. Now you begin to walk inland, away from the open riverbank and toward the low silhouette of the city. You can't call it a skyline. Exactly. It's more like a long, earthen wave. Mud brick walls, temple platforms, rooftops pressed close together, and as you approach, the air changes. It's less watery and more human. Smoke, cooked grain, animal breath, damp wool. Even the mud underfoot becomes different, packed down by thousands of steps. Smooth in the center of paths and crumbly at the edges. What's broadly accepted is that cities do not simply happen. They are built, maintained, repaired, and constantly negotiated. And if you've ever tried to organize a group chat, You already understand the basic problem. Multiply that by several thousand people. Remove emojis, add goats, and suddenly you have an ancient city-state. Your brain tries to picture it, and it almost yawns from the effort. One interpretation is that the city itself becomes a kind of human-making machine. That's not a claim of intention. Like someone sat down and said, "Let's manufacture humans." It's more like the way a river shapes stones without planning to. A careful reading might suggest that once you live in a dense place with walls, schedules, ration systems, and public rituals, you begin to behave and even think differently. You become legible to authorities. You become countable. You become someone whose life can be summarized on a tablet with a few marks. That is interpretation. But it's grounded in the mainstream reality that early urban systems relied on record-keeping and coordination. You step through a gate, and you feel the subtle pressure of being inside. Outside, the horizon is wide. Inside, your world is corridors, courtyards, and the constant brush of other lives. A child runs past carrying something that might be bread, or might be a small lump of clay they're not supposed to have. A woman scolds someone in a tone that needs no translation. A dog looks at you with the weary expression of a creature that has already seen too much nonsense for its age. Archaeology suggests that temples and related institutions play a central role in many Mesopotamian cities, especially early on. The evidence we do have points to large communal buildings, storerooms, and administrative spaces. Most historians agree that these institutions are tied to religion, but also to economics and governance. It's not that the sacred and the practical are separate here. They are braided together. One interpretation is that when people say, "the god owns the land," it may also function as a social way of saying, "the institution controls the land." That's a possibility, not a certainty. And scholars continue to debate how literal or symbolic such language is in different contexts. You pass a storeroom area, and you can almost hear the sound of grain pouring, dry, steady, like sand. Someone is counting aloud, and another person is making marks. The city breathes through these small acts. Most historians agree that ration systems exist, especially for workers connected to large institutions, and archaeology suggests that administrators track goods with meticulous care. If you listen closely, the city's heartbeat might be a tally. And this is where the human-making machine idea starts to feel less like poetry and more like a gentle observation. Because the city is not only a place you live, it is a pattern that trains you. It teaches you when to wake, where to go, how to stand in line, what you are allowed to carry, who you must address with respect, and who can ignore you without consequence. Your identity becomes partly social role. Your name becomes partly an entry. That is not a conspiracy. It's just what large systems do. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Because it's easy to let modern cynicism sneak in wearing a fake mustache. This is not saying ancient people are robots or that they have no agency. The evidence we do have points to creativity, trade, art, family life, and countless daily choices. But it's possible that early urban structures create new categories of personhood. Worker, scribe, priest, debtor, foreigner, dependent, child, widow. If you're feeling sleepy, notice how calming it is to let these categories drift by like boats on the river. Because the point is not to memorize them. The point is to sense the shift. Now we let the cinematic "what if" mood float in, clearly labeled as imagination. What if becoming human in this setting is less about being born and more about being enrolled? What if you become fully someone when the city recognizes you, when your labor is registered, when your ration is issued, when your name is pressed into clay? That's imagined mood, not a documented claim, but it's a mood that fits a world where writing begins in administration and where institutions hold many people together like mortar between bricks. A potter's workshop sits open to the street. You see hands shaping clay on a slow wheel, the wet slip shining in the light. And you think, almost involuntarily, about how the same substance becomes both a bowl and a document. The bowl holds food, the tablet holds decisions, the city holds you. And if you're not careful, the city also holds your attention in the way a modern phone does. Except instead of scrolling, you're carrying reeds and barley and trying not to step in something unpleasant. Spoiler, you step in something unpleasant. Civilization does not eliminate that particular experience. Most historians agree that cities like Uruk show signs of planned spaces and monumental architecture, and archaeology suggests that large-scale building projects require organized labor. The evidence we do have points to coordination. Someone decides, someone directs, someone records. One interpretation is that this coordination changes how people imagine order itself. You don't just see a river. You see canals. You don't just see seasons. You see calendars. You don't just see neighbors. You see households, districts, obligations. Historians still argue whether the rise of cities in Mesopotamia is driven more by economic opportunity, environmental pressures, social competition, or religious centralization, or some mix that changes from place to place. That debate matters because it reminds you there isn't one single lever labeled city on. There's no full consensus. And that's healthy. Tonight, we're not choosing a single cause. We're watching how the city reshapes the person. Now, we step lightly into a fringe tidbit, clearly framed. A fringe idea proposes that early Mesopotamian cities appear too sudden or too advanced, suggesting some external catalyst. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because the jump from village life to monumental city life feels dramatic when you compress centuries into a paragraph. A more cautious explanation could be that the suddenness is partly an illusion created by patchy evidence and the way archaeology preserves some phases better than others. The evidence we do have points to gradual development, experimentation, and regional variation. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can still let the question hover: what if there were bursts of innovation sparked by unusual circumstances, climate shifts, migrations, trade contacts, charismatic leaders, or simply lucky combinations of ideas? You walk past a group of workers carrying reeds, and you notice the way they move together, not quite in step, but in a shared tempo. The city teaches tempo. The city teaches patience. The city teaches what happens if you don't cooperate. And you realize, with a sleepy little smile, that the earliest origin story in a Sumerian city might not be a myth about creation at all. It might be the story of how people learned to belong to a system bigger than their own household. If you listen closely, you can hear the small sounds of that belonging: a stamp on a clay, a shouted count, the squeak of a door, the low hum of voices in a courtyard, and in the background, always, the river's hush, reminding you that even the city's power sits beside water that will outlast it. So you keep walking, letting the city's rhythm settle into your breathing. You're not racing toward answers. You're letting the question become part of the night. What if Sumer's different origin of humanity is not about secret beings or hidden histories, but about how a city turns a crowd into people, and then turns people into names on clay? You keep moving through the city's packed lanes, and the ground under your feet feels more certain now. Less squish, more stomp. The river is still nearby, but here the sound is muffled by walls and voices and the steady, domestic orchestra of life. A pot being set down, a goat making a complaint to management, a baby testing out a new volume setting. The air tastes faintly of smoke and grain. And when you inhale, you get that warm, dusty sweetness that clings to places where people store food in bulk. You drift toward a small administrative corner. Nothing grand, just a shaded space where a few people sit low, close to the earth, with clay at their fingertips. A basket holds soft tablets like damp bread rolls. A jar holds reed styluses cut at angles. You watch one scribe roll a little cylinder seal across clay, leaving a neat band of images like a tiny parade. Most historians agree that seals and administrative markings become important in early Mesopotamian systems, and archaeology suggests that these tools help identify people, institutions, and goods. The evidence we do have points to a world that begins to trust marks. What's broadly accepted is that writing here does not begin as poetry. It begins as counting. It begins as how many, how much, who owes, who received. You can almost feel the first signs in your body, not sentences, but tallies, not stories, but totals. If you listen carefully, the earliest writing might sound less like language and more like a quiet little click of a mental abacus. And if that feels underwhelming, just remember, this is the same species that later invents epic literature, symphonies, and microwave instructions that still somehow confuse people. We start where we can. Archaeology suggests that the earliest tablets include numerical notations and simple pictographic signs tied to commodities and administration. The evidence we do have points to evolution over time, with signs becoming more standardized and more capable of representing sounds and grammar. Most historians agree that this long transformation eventually produces true writing systems that can capture complex speech. That's the solid ground. But tonight, you're watching something more subtle than a technical invention. You're watching a habit forming. A careful reading might suggest that lists don't just record reality, they train attention. They teach you what counts as important enough to be counted. They teach you to slice the world into categories that fit into a grid. Grain, sheep, labor days, jars of oil, bricks, textiles. Over and over. The city repeats the lesson. The world is manageable if you can sort it. One interpretation is that this sorting quietly reshapes the human mind, not in a mystical way, but in a practical one. If you spend your days turning messy life into neat marks, your brain learns to prefer neatness. It learns that the world can be itemized. It learns that a person can be summarized. That is interpretation, not certainty. But it's a reasonable interpretation that fits what we know about administrative cultures. The evidence we do have points to writing being closely tied to institutions. And institutions tend to love categories the way cats love boxes. If it fits, it sits. You watch a scribe press the stylus into clay with a steady rhythm. Tap, press, lift, like raindrops in slow motion. A small pile of tablets sits nearby, each one carrying a tiny world, and you start to wonder, softly, whether the earliest origin story in Sumer is hiding inside that rhythm, not in the content of the tablet, but in the act of making it. Because here's the thing, writing begins as an external memory. And once memory lives outside the body, you can build on it. You can add. You can compare. You can correct. You can disagree and still keep the argument intact for someone who isn't even born yet. Most historians agree that writing enables more complex administration and long-distance coordination. And archaeology suggests that literate systems help sustain dense urban life. That's documented in the broad sense. Now the mist rolls in. But we keep it labeled. What if the earliest signs are less about words and more about training the mind? What if the true origin being recorded is the origin of a new kind of thinking, one that can hold abstraction steady, one that can treat an invisible thing like debt as real because a tablet says it is? That's gentle imagination, not a claim. We're not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. You lean closer and see that a single tablet can be oddly intimate. It might list barley, yes, but it also contains fingerprints, tiny ridges pressed accidentally into the surface. The scribe's hand is in the record. The person receiving the barley might have stood right there, waiting, maybe nervous, maybe bored, maybe hungry. And suddenly the list feels like a human scene, not just an economic document. Let me rephrase that more carefully. It's possible that writing changes cognition in some ways, but it's also possible that it mainly changes systems, how people coordinate and enforce decisions. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Scholars continue to debate how literacy affects thought across societies. And in ancient contexts, the evidence is indirect. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. You notice how the scribe's posture is both relaxed and tense. Relaxed because it's routine, tense because mistakes matter. A wrong mark could mean someone is shorted food or accused of stealing. And this is where your modern brain makes a sleepy little joke to itself. Congratulations. Humanity. You invented writing and immediately used it to create the ancient version of "this invoice is incorrect." Progress. A runner arrives with a small bundle, and the scribes glance up. Someone mutters something like a supervisor, and you can tell without knowing the words that the tone means. Do it again, but neatly. Most historians agree that scribal training becomes formalized over time, and archaeology suggests that later, school tablets show copying exercises and lists repeated again and again. Even if the earliest phase is less clearly documented, the broader pattern points to writing becoming a learned craft. One interpretation is that repetition, the copying of lists, the drilling of signs, turns writing into muscle memory, a bodily skill. And what if that bodily skill is part of the different origin? Humans becoming the kind of creatures who can outsource memory to clay. Historians still argue whether the earliest writing was invented primarily for economic needs or whether other pressures, political authority, social competition, ritual display, also drove its development. There's no full consensus, and that's okay. The city rarely has just one motive, the way you rarely eat just one potato chip. You tell yourself it will be one. The bag tells a different story. Now, carefully, we touch a fringe tidbit, clearly framed. A popular rumor claims that the earliest cuneiform signs hide secret messages, codes about lost knowledge, hidden origins, even instructions from non-human teachers. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that what looks hidden to us is often just a specialized administrative shorthand we haven't fully interpreted, or symbols that make sense only in their original context. The evidence we do have points to writing being used in straightforward ways: accounting, ownership, temple distributions, agreements. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can understand why the rumor persists. When you can't read a script, it's tempting to imagine it says something dramatic, especially when the tablets are ancient, and the people who wrote them are long gone. You watch another tablet being formed, and you notice how quickly it happens. A lump of clay, flattened, a few presses, a seal roll, set aside. It's so simple it's almost hypnotic. And you realize something. Even if the content is mundane, the process is revolutionary. A list might look boring, but it quietly creates a world where boring can be powerful. It makes routine enforceable. It makes promises traceable. It makes society less dependent on one person's memory and more dependent on shared records. One interpretation is that these early lists also shape values. If you record grain, grain becomes central. If you record labor, labor becomes measurable. If you record household heads, households become administrative units. Over time, what you measure becomes what you manage, and what you manage becomes what you prioritize. That's interpretation, but it fits a pattern you can see in many societies. Attention follows the ledger, so you let the scene settle like dust in lamplight. The reeds whisper outside the walls. The clay dries quietly. The scribes keep pressing marks into the future, and you hold the question again, warm and careful. What if Sumerian records suggest a different origin of humanity? Not a single moment of creation, but a slow training of mind and society, where the first words are numbers, and the first stories are lists, and the first transformation is learning to believe in marks. You step back, letting the soft tap of stylus on clay fade into the city's larger hush, and you carry that rhythm with you like a heartbeat as you walk on. You keep walking, and the city's rhythm keeps walking with you, tap of sandals, creak of reed baskets, a distant call that rises and falls like a bird that forgot its indoor. The lanes narrow, then widen into a small open space where people gather in the lazy way of a place that has been doing public life for a long time. The air smells like baked clay and warm dust, with that faint tang of animal hide that always seems to live near workshops. Somewhere near the edge of the square, you see a scribe again. It's hard to escape them. Honestly, you could move to a deserted island and still find a scribe there with a clipboard, ready to ask you to sign for your coconut ration. The scribe's hands are busy with a tablet, but the vibe is different. Less counting, more naming. And names, you notice, feel heavier than numbers. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian king lists exist in multiple versions and blend different kinds of information. Archaeology suggests that these lists were copied and preserved over long periods, and the evidence we do have points to a mix of historical memory, political messaging, and literary tradition. What's broadly accepted is that they are not simple modern-style chronologies. They are, in many ways, statements about legitimacy. Who should be remembered, and in what order? You lean in, sleepy curious, the way you lean toward a campfire story. The tablet is not necessarily a Sumerian king list in the famous capital letter sense. Tonight we are staying in mood, not claiming you're literally peeking over a scholar's shoulder. But the idea is close. A list of rulers, dynasties, reign lengths, transitions, names stacked like bricks, and then you feel the mist begin to curl at the edges. Because here's where numbers get weird. Some reign lengths in these traditions are extremely long. So long they make your modern brain squint. Thousands of years. Tens of thousands. If you're half asleep, you might even think, sure, why not? I've had meetings that felt that long. But let's keep our footing. One interpretation is that these huge numbers are symbolic rather than literal, ways of expressing greatness, antiquity, divine favor, or cosmic order. A more cautious explanation could be that different counting systems, copying errors, or ideological motives shape the numbers we see. Scholars continue to debate how to interpret specific figures and what they reflect about the text's purposes. The evidence we do have points to the lists being composed and edited across time, which means they can carry layers of meaning like sediment. Now you can feel the question forming. What does it mean to put origins into a list? Most historians agree that writing can preserve memory, but it can also organize it. When you list something, you create an order, and order creates meaning. A careful reading might suggest that king lists do not only record rulers, they teach listeners what rule is. They teach that leadership comes in a line, that power moves from one city to another, that legitimacy can be narrated like a relay race. This is interpretation, but it's not wild. Lists are never neutral. They choose what to include. They choose what to leave out. They choose the rhythm of remembrance. And in a sleep-friendly way, you start to notice the almost hypnotic structure, the city's history turned into a chain. Name, reign, city, name, reign, city. Like a lullaby of authority, here comes the cinematic what if, clearly framed as imagination. What if the list is not trying to tell you how long someone lived, but how far away they feel? What if those immense reigns are a way of pointing to a time so distant it blurs into myth, like trying to remember your earliest childhood dream? What if the list is saying, this began long ago, in the only dramatic language it has? Enormous numbers. That's imagined mood, not proof. Still, the mist invites a fringe thought, and we'll label it properly. A fringe idea proposes that those long reigns reflect non-human rulers or a lost era of different beings, perhaps semi-divine kings, perhaps visitors, perhaps something stranger. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians agree that mythic exaggeration is common across many cultures. A more cautious explanation could be that the long reigns are literary, symbolic, or ideological, not biological. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why it captivates people. It makes the past feel inhabited by giants of time. You let that thought float like a moth around the lamp, without letting it land as fact. Now, you watch the scribe's hand pause on a name, and you realize that even if the numbers are symbolic, the act of naming is powerful. To name a king is to define a before and after, to place a human, or a figure standing in for something, into the flow of time. Archaeology suggests that early Mesopotamian societies invest heavily in institutions of memory, temples, rituals, monuments, texts. The evidence we do have points to remembering being a civic act, not just a private one. One interpretation is that the king list functions like a cultural spine. It gives the city-states a shared narrative structure, a beginning, transitions, continuity. And when a society builds continuity, it also builds identity. That's where our different origin theme returns. Perhaps humanity is not defined by a single creation moment, but by the moment a community begins to place itself in a long story, with names that can be recited. You become human in the sense that you belong to an unfolding narrative. Historians still argue whether the king lists were meant primarily as historical records, political propaganda, religious texts, or educational tools, or some blend that shifts over time. There's no full consensus, which is your cue to relax your shoulders. The past is allowed to be complicated. You don't need to solve it tonight. You just need to feel the shape of the debate. You step away from the scribe and drift toward a low wall where someone has left a basket of clay lumps. The clay has the same color as the city, because the city is clay. Really, and it's almost funny how literally true that is. Mud brick walls, clay tablets, pottery. Even the dust is powdered earth. If you've ever wondered why Mesopotamian archaeology is so obsessed with mud, it's because mud is doing most of the work. You rest your hand on the wall is warm from the day. You think about how people might have stood here centuries apart, touching the same surface, telling the same names, arguing about the same legitimacy. One interpretation is that the list is a tool of stability. It says the world has order. Even if floods come, even if wars happen, even if rulers fall, the list reassures there is a sequence, and then you remember our truth ladder. Softly, documented. Lists exist and blend myth and history. Interpreted. Lists shape legitimacy and identity. Imagined. The numbers are like dream distances, hinting at a time beyond confirmation. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. A small joke drifts in, because your sleepy host cannot resist if you ever feel unproductive. Just remember that someone once claimed a king reigned for tens of thousands of years, and nobody in that meeting raised their hand to say, "Excuse me, can we check the math?" Either they were very polite, very intimidated, or the coffee was terrible. Now you walk again, and you let the king list idea settle into your mind as a quiet possibility. What if Sumer's different origin is not a single creation myth, but a shift in how people understood time and authority, how they began to place humanity inside a structured past, with names and sequences, with legitimacy pressed into clay? You pass a doorway where a family sits in the cool shade, sharing food. A child looks up, curious, and you think, no matter how long the lists are, no matter how strange the numbers, the city is still made of moments like this. Someone eating, someone laughing softly, someone glancing at the sky to see if the heat is easing. The list is the spine, but life is the breathing around it. And somewhere behind you, the scribe keeps writing, because the city loves a list and the night loves a story. You keep walking, and the city keeps quietly rearranging itself around you, alleys turning into courtyards, courtyards turning into corridors, corridors opening into a space that feels different in your chest before your eyes even catch up. The air smells less like cooking smoke and more like incense and old plaster, that faint mineral scent of walls that have been rebuilt so many times they feel layered. Like a cake nobody asked for, but everybody keeps eating anyway. Most historians agree that temples and temple-centered institutions play major roles in many Mesopotamian city-states, especially in the early phases when administration, religion, and economy are tightly braided together. Archaeology suggests that large communal buildings and storerooms exist, and the evidence we do have points to organized activity around them: offering, distributions, festivals, labor management, and the steady maintenance of sacred spaces. That's the documented ground, solid and quiet beneath your sandals. You step into a temple precinct, and you feel the way people's voices soften without being told. It's not fear, exactly. It's more like the way you lower your tone when you enter a library, except here the library is a god's house. And the shelves might be full of barley. The walls are mud brick, plastered smooth and bright in places, and the light is warmer, filtered through doorways and shade. A priest, or someone who looks like the kind of person who knows where the important keys are kept, passes by with a calm seriousness that says, "Please do not touch anything sacred, and also, do not touch anything expensive." What's broadly accepted is that in Mesopotamian thought, gods are deeply involved in the ordering of the world. Cities are often associated with specific deities, and temples act as focal points for communal identity. The evidence we do have points to ritual life being regular and structured, not an occasional dramatic moment. Most historians agree that people bring offerings, perform ceremonies, and interpret omens. And yet, archaeology also suggests something practical. These temple spaces are hubs of storage, labor, and administration. If you're half asleep, this is where you appreciate how beautifully ancient societies refuse to separate spiritual and economic. Here, the sacred and the spreadsheet share a wall. One interpretation is that when texts say, "The god owns the land," the phrase might function on more than one level. It might be devotional. It might be political. It might be administrative shorthand for the institution's control over resources. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Scholars continue to debate how literal the language of divine ownership is in different contexts, and it likely varies across time and city. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, you can feel how power moves through these spaces, not as a villain, not as a conspiracy, but as a structure. A careful reading might suggest that temples don't only host worship, they shape what a person is within a city. They define duties, they define purity, they define festivals, which define calendars, which define time, and time, once defined, defines you right back. You notice a small line of workers waiting near a distribution point. Someone holds a tablet, someone holds a seal, someone holds a container. The scene is almost boring, which is exactly why it matters. Archaeology suggests that temple administrations track goods and labor, and the evidence we do have points to ration distributions, work assignments, and resource management. Most historians agree that such systems can support large populations, but they can also reinforce hierarchy. That's mainstream history, steady and unromantic. Now the different origin question turns slightly, like a lamp being adjusted. What if, in Sumerian records, humans are defined less by being created and more by being placed into a cosmic and civic order managed through temples? One interpretation is that humanity here is a role, the beings who serve, maintain, cultivate, and honor the gods, keeping the world functioning through ritual and work. That's interpretation, but it fits a broadly accepted feature of Mesopotamian worldview. Humans and gods exist in a relationship of obligation and care. And here comes the cinematic "what if," carefully labeled as imagination. What if divine names are masks the city wears at night, not in the sense of gods aren't real, which would be a modern argument we don't need to make. More like this: what if the gods, in the records, are also a way of describing the city's own needs, its hunger for labor, its demand for order, its fear of chaos? What if calling something the will of the god is sometimes the city speaking with a bigger voice? That's imagined mood, not a claim. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You drift deeper into the precinct, and you see carved or painted symbols, simple but potent. You see offerings set out with care. You hear a low chant somewhere, and the sound is less like performance and more like maintenance, the way you hum while you clean. Most historians agree that ritual repetition matters in ancient religions, and archaeology suggests that temples are built and rebuilt over long spans, sometimes on the same sacred footprint. The evidence we do have points to continuity being an achievement. Historians still argue whether temple institutions in early Mesopotamia are primarily religious centers that happen to manage resources, or primarily economic administrative centers that express their authority through religion. There's no full consensus, and it's possible that different temples function differently at different times. That debate is a quiet reminder that we're walking through living systems, not simple labels. Now we touch a fringe tidbit, clearly framed. A fringe idea proposes that when Mesopotamian texts speak of gods descending or establishing cities, they are referencing literal visitors, beings who arrive, teach, and rule. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians agree that mythic language is not a straightforward record of events. A more cautious explanation could be that descent language encodes theological ideas, political legitimacy, or metaphorical relationships between heaven and earth. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why it's attractive. It turns temple life into a kind of cosmic embassy. You let that idea float in the mist for a moment, then return your attention to the solid ground, the feel of plaster under your fingertips, the smell of grain stored in cool rooms, the steady human choreography of a complex institution. The evidence we do have points to people working, organizing, worshipping, negotiating, and that is already astonishing, even without visitors from the stars. You notice a scribe again. Yes, again. Seated near a doorway with a small stack of tablets. The scribe's calm expression suggests they have already processed more paperwork than is spiritually healthy. The stylus moves, and you hear the familiar hush-hush of clay taking marks. You realize the motif is following you. Reeds, clay, record. It's like the city's lullaby. One interpretation is that the temple is where the city's abstract ideas become concrete. The god is invisible, but the storeroom is real. The blessing is intangible, but the ration is measurable. And in that overlap, a particular kind of human identity forms. Humans as the mediators between earth and the divine order. Humans as caretakers of cosmic routine. Humans as the beings who keep the lamps lit and the canals flowing. A small, sleepy joke slips in as you watch a priest supervise a task. If you've ever worked in a place where the mission statement is inspirational but the daily reality is, please submit Form 7B, you already understand temple life in principle. The mission, uphold the cosmic order. The task, count the sheep. The sheep, for their part, remain unconvinced by metaphysics. Now you stand at the edge of the precinct and look back at the city beyond it. The temple is not separate. It's central. It anchors identity. It anchors time. It anchors memory. And so the different origin idea becomes calmer and clearer. Perhaps Sumerian records are not primarily telling you where humans physically came from. They might be telling you how humans are positioned, how a society defines what humans are for, how they fit into a world of gods, cities, labor, and ritual. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And tonight, as you walk out under the night air again, you carry the thought like a small lamp. In Sumer, to be human might mean to be part of an order the temple names, the city enforces, and the clay remembers. You step back out into the open air, and the night feels wider again, cooler, softer, less perfumed by incense and more honest with river damp. The city's noise thins into a low murmur behind you, like a room full of people trying not to wake someone sleeping. The lantern glow is smaller now, and the sky above is enormous, sprinkled with stars that look steady enough to trust, even though the ground beneath your feet has a long history of not being steady at all. Most historians agree that life in southern Mesopotamia is shaped by water in two opposite moods, water as gift and water as threat. Archaeology suggests that irrigation and river management are central to agriculture and urban growth, and the evidence we do have points to canals, levees, and the constant labor of guiding water where people want it to go. But the same evidence also points to floods, shifting river courses, and the simple fact that a flat plain can become a shallow sea if the river decides to overachieve. You walk toward a low area outside the densest streets, where the land dips and the soil feels different underfoot. It's finer, more silty, as if the river has been here recently, even if recently might mean in someone's great-grandparents' time. And you think about how archaeology sometimes reads like a layered cake. Habitation debris, ash, broken pottery, rebuilt walls, then, suddenly, a clean band of sediment like a pale seam running through the story. The evidence we do have points to flood deposits found at various Mesopotamian sites, though not all at the same time and not all in the same way. Archaeology suggests that some cities experienced significant flooding events that left recognizable layers. What's broadly accepted is that floods happened, but not necessarily as one single, synchronized catastrophe covering the entire region. That distinction matters because it keeps us on solid ground. Now the story angle tilts toward memory. Because regardless of whether floods were local or widespread, people remembered them. People tell flood stories the way they tell stories about storms that tore the roof off, or rivers that swallowed a road, events that feel like the world briefly forgot the rules. One interpretation is that later flood myths in Mesopotamian traditions might compress many different flood experiences into one narrative. A careful reading might suggest that the one great flood is sometimes a cultural shorthand, not a literal timestamp, but a moral and emotional memory of what water can do. That's interpretation, and it fits the way societies often build big stories out of repeated smaller shocks. And here, very gently, is where the logic of forgetting enters. Because a flood doesn't just destroy buildings, it can erase archives, scatter families, disrupt rituals, and scramble the careful order of a city. If writing and administration are part of what makes the urban human, then a flood is not only a physical event, it's an attack on legibility. The city's categories dissolve in brown water, names wash away, boundaries blur. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We can't always link a specific archaeological flood layer to a specific literary flood story with certainty. That's a possibility, not a certainty. The evidence is complicated, and scholars continue to debate which narratives reflect which events. If any, if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, what's broadly accepted is that flood stories become important in Mesopotamian literature, and later traditions in the region echo similar motifs. Most historians agree that these stories often involve divine decisions, human warnings, survival, and rebuilding. Archaeology suggests that rebuilding is a constant reality in cities made of mud brick. Walls collapse, floors are resurfaced, streets rise as debris accumulates. The evidence we do have points to a landscape where starting over is not an exceptional moment but a regular skill. Now we let the cinematic what-if mood drift in, clearly labeled as imagination. What if the reset in the flood stories is not mainly about wiping out people, but about wiping out a particular social order? What if the story is pointing at something else, like the way disaster can clear the slate of hierarchy, contracts, debts, and the whole tangled web of who owes whom? That's imagined mood, not a documented claim. But it's a mood that matches the psychological power of flood narratives. Water as eraser. And here's a sleepy little joke. Because your host can't help it, if you've ever spilled coffee on a laptop and watched your entire week evaporate, you already understand flood mythology in miniature. The gods, caffeine, the tablet, your hard drive. The flood, one clumsy elbow, the moral, back up your files. You wander along the edge of a canal, and the water is dark, reflecting stars and pieces. You hear frogs, tune a soft chorus that makes the night feel older than the city. A worker walks by carrying a shovel, and you feel the endlessness of maintenance. Most historians agree that canals require constant dredging and repair, and archaeology suggests large-scale water management over long periods. The evidence we do have points to collective labor being necessary for survival. That's mainstream history, steady and firm. Now we touch a fringe tidbit, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that flood myths encode the memory of a single enormous event, perhaps a sudden regional inundation, perhaps a dramatic sea level intrusion, perhaps even something more exotic. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that flood stories draw from repeated local disasters and literary motifs, becoming grander with retelling. The evidence we do have points to multiple flood layers at different sites and times, which complicates the idea of one uniform deluge. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can still let the question hover. Could some especially dramatic flood have left an outsized imprint on memory? Historians still argue whether the most influential flood narratives are rooted in specific historical floods, in broader environmental realities, or in mythic structures shared across cultures. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is not a failure. It's part of the story. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You pause and listen to the water. It's calm now, but you can imagine it rising. You can imagine mud brick walls soaking, slumping, dissolving into the same substance they came from, and you can imagine the aftermath. People standing in silence, trying to find familiar corners, trying to salvage tools and jars and maybe a tablet or two that survived because it was fired in a kiln or hidden in a dry place. One interpretation is that floods force societies to rethink order. They reveal what's fragile. They expose who has resources and who doesn't. They make people renegotiate authority. Who organizes rebuilding? Who controls the remaining grain? Who decides where to dig new channels? In that sense, a flood can be a kind of social hinge, not because it magically transforms everyone, but because it pressures systems until they bend. And this returns us to the different origin question in a quiet way. If earlier sections have suggested that humanity in Sumer might be shaped by city life, record-keeping, and temple order, then floods become moments when that constructed identity is tested. The human of the city is a person who fits into lists and calendars. The flood says, "Not tonight." The flood interrupts the lullaby of administration. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues, and the clue here is emotional as much as archaeological. People who live beside unpredictable rivers will always carry a story about water as judgment, as cleansing, as warning, as rebirth. Even if each flood is local, the feeling is universal. You start walking back toward the city, and you notice the smell of wet earth again, the same smell you began with on the riverbank, like a soft callback. It's the same motif, the same substance. Clay. Clay makes the city, and clay records the city, and clay can be returned to shapelessness by floodwater. In that cycle, you can sense why flood myths matter. They are not just about destruction, they are about the fragile miracle of order. And as you approach the walls, you hold a calm possibility in your mind. What if the origin being hinted at in Sumerian traditions is not a one-time creation, but a repeating pattern of building and erasing, organizing and losing, remembering and forgetting? Humanity as something rebuilt each time the waters recede. You come back into the city with the smell of wet earth still clinging to your thoughts like a soft cloak. The river is behind you now, but not really, because in a place like this, water is always behind you, ahead of you, under you, and occasionally trying to climb into your house uninvited. The streets feel warmer, drier, and the night hum is thicker here. Distant conversation, A cough, the clack of pottery, the tiny squeal of a door hinge that has never known oil. You drift toward a part of the city that doesn't look heroic. No shining monument, no dramatic stairway, just workspaces, storerooms, and the places where people stand in lines that move slowly enough to make you question your life choices. Most historians agree that early Mesopotamian societies rely on organized labor, and archaeology suggests that ration systems and administrative records track distributions of food and materials. The evidence we do have points to people being paid, often in kind, through allocations of grain, oil, beer, textiles. That's the documented ground. And it's surprisingly concrete. You can almost taste the barley. A worker steps out of a doorway carrying a basket, shoulders rounded from repetition. Another person walks by with a tablet tucked under an arm, like a clipboard before clipboards were cool. A careful reading might suggest that these little scenes, repeated thousands of times, are where human identity becomes measurable, not in some cosmic sense, in an institutional sense. You are what you receive. You are what you owe. You are the amount of labor assigned to your name. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That's an interpretation, not a certainty. People are always more than their rations. But it's possible that a system that distributes resources through records will inevitably shape how people are seen and how they see themselves. The evidence we do have points to administration being central in urban life. And administration likes categories the way a sleepy person likes pillows. It wants everything in its proper place. You pause near a distribution point, where a small group waits with containers. Someone with authority checks a tablet, then nods. Then someone else measures out grain. The process is so routine it feels almost soothing, until you remember that routine is only soothing if you're the one getting the grain. If you're not, routine feels like a locked door. Most historians agree that inequality exists in early complex societies, even if its forms vary. Archaeology suggests differences in housing, burial goods, and access to resources. The evidence we do have points to elites and administrators having different lives than laborers. That's mainstream history, steady and not especially romantic. Cities bring opportunity, yes, but they also bring hierarchy, and hierarchy brings paperwork. If you listen closely, you can hear the paperless bureaucracy breathing. One interpretation is that ration tablets do more than record distribution. They also create dependence. If your food comes from an institution, then the institution's schedule becomes your schedule. Its priorities become your priorities. And if that sounds modern, it's because it is modern. You are not the first human to look at a system and think, I guess my life is a spreadsheet now. The only difference is that their spreadsheet is clay and yours is glowing. Both can ruin your mood. Now we bring in the quiet rebellions, because humans are never just passive entries. The evidence we do have points to disputes, lawsuits, contracts, and records of obligations, signs that people negotiate, argue, and sometimes resist. Archaeology suggests that daily life includes countless small acts that don't leave neat traces, shortcuts taken, favors traded, rules bent, friendships that soften the edges of hierarchy. A careful reading might suggest that rebellion in an early city often looks less like dramatic uprising and more like survival tactics. A worker showing up late, a foreman looking the other way, a family pooling rations, someone swapping a measure on the sly. That is interpretation, because we can't always see those acts directly. But it's a reasonable interpretation because humans are consistent in one delightful way. If there is a rule, someone is already figuring out how close they can stand to it without technically breaking it. And here comes one of your light jokes for the section. You watch a measure being used and think, ah yes, the ancient origin of the phrase that doesn't look like a full portion. Somewhere in this city, someone is definitely saying, "I swear my jar was bigger yesterday." History repeats, and it loves snacks. What's broadly accepted is that writing expands beyond accounting over time. But even in accounting, you can find stories. You see names, sometimes single names, sometimes names tied to households or roles. You see numbers that imply families, dependents, teams. And you realize a ration list is a kind of portrait. Not a flattering portrait, sure. No one frames it and hangs it over the hearth like, "Behold, my 2.5 liters of beer allocation." But it's still a record of existence. One interpretation is that this is where the different origin of humanity gets startlingly practical. What if humanity in these records is not defined first by a mythic creation, but by participation in a rationed, scheduled, recorded world? What if the story is pointing at something else, like the origin of the administered self? That's an interpretation angle, not a claim of fact. But it fits the mainstream reality that early cities are built on organized distribution. Now we allow the cinematic what-if mood to drift in, clearly framed as imagination. What if the true creation scene in Sumer is not a god molding clay, but an administrator pressing a stylus into a tablet and saying, in effect, "You exist in the system now"? What if being made is being recorded? That's imagined mood, not documented fact. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Historians still argue whether ration systems in early Mesopotamia reflect a broadly redistributive economy, a form of labor control, an emergency safety net, or a mixture that shifts by institution and period. There's no full consensus, and the details vary across time and city. But the broad pattern, resources tracked, labor organized, is well supported by evidence. Now we touch a quirky, fringe-adjacent tidbit, carefully labeled. A popular rumor claims that some ancient ration lists and labor records hide coded references to non-human workers or special classes of beings, usually because people read later myths backward into earlier documents. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that unusual terms in texts often refer to specialized professions, dependent statuses, or administrative categories we don't fully translate cleanly. The evidence we do have points to human labor being the backbone of these economies. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why people get curious when a text is partially understood. Imagination fills gaps like water fills a low place. You watch a group of workers file away, shoulders tired but movements practiced. Someone laughs quietly at a joke you don't hear, and the laughter is the most human thing in the whole administrative scene. The city may classify people, but people still crack jokes, still share food, still complain about supervisors, still invent nicknames, still fall in love in inconvenient places. Administration doesn't erase that. It just tries to count around it. You step aside and notice a child sitting on a low step, tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. The shapes look like tiny wedges, maybe copying what they've seen scribes do, maybe just enjoying the feel of lines in dirt. Most historians agree that scribal education becomes formalized over time, but even before formal schools, children watch and imitate. The evidence we do have points to writing becoming part of the social landscape, and that's a quiet kind of origin too. The origin of a culture where symbols are as common as stones. Another light joke drifts in. You imagine a parent saying, "Stop drawing cuneiform in the dust and wash your hands." And you realize parenting is also timeless. Different century, same battle. So you keep walking, letting the city's practical heart beat around you. The reeds whisper outside the walls. The clay tablets dry in stacks. and the question stays gentle. What if Sumerian records tell a different origin of humanity? Not as a secret cosmic twist, but as a slow shift where being human becomes increasingly tied to systems of labor, rations, and recorded obligation, with little quiet rebellions flickering in the margins like candlelight. You keep walking until the streets loosen their grip and the city's edge begins to show itself. Not a clean line, more like a gradual thinning, where houses become smaller, courtyards open wider, and the air smells less like packed humanity and more like open river plain. You feel it in your shoulders, that subtle relief of space. Even the sounds change. Inside the city, noise bounces. Out here, it drifts away and dissolves. Near a gate, you see movement that doesn't match the neighborhood rhythm. A few figures stand with bundles and long poles, their clothing cut a little differently, their hair tied in a style you haven't seen on every corner. Donkeys shift weight under unfamiliar loads. A man speaks with an accent you can't quite place, not because you understand the language, but because you can hear the shape of difference in the cadence. You realize the city gate is not just a boundary, it's a membrane. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian city-states are connected to wider trade networks, and archaeology suggests that goods and materials move across long distances even in early periods. The evidence we do have points to imports like stone, metals, and luxury materials that aren't easily found in the alluvial plain. On the solid ground of mainstream history, this means simple, practical things. People travel. Merchants negotiate. Boats move along rivers. Caravans cross dry land, and cities become knots in a larger net. You stand near the gate and watch a small exchange. A local official gestures toward a bundle. A traveler opens it. Something glints. Maybe metal. Maybe polished stone. A scribe is nearby. Of course, because the city is physically incapable of witnessing anything without wanting to record it. The reed stylus makes its soft, hush-hush sound on damp clay, and the motif follows you again. Reeds, clay, record. It's like the city's lullaby. Now playing at the border. One interpretation is that foreign figures in Sumerian stories and later Mesopotamian literature might encode real contact and migration rather than pure fantasy. A careful reading might suggest that when a narrative mentions distant lands, unusual goods, or stranger kings, it is sometimes echoing lived experience, the arrival of outsiders, the prestige of imported materials, the tension between local tradition and new influence. That's interpretation, not certainty. Stories can exaggerate. Names can be symbolic. But it's possible that trade and travel quietly feed the imagination. You watch someone pass through the gate, and you think about how a city decides who belongs. The evidence we do have points to categories: citizens, dependents, workers, foreigners. Though the exact terms and boundaries vary across time and place, what's broadly accepted is that cities protect themselves, and gates are part of that protection. But gates also invite what the city needs: goods, labor, information. You could say the gate is where the city breathes in. A traveler lifts a small jar, and the smell that escapes is sharp and sweet, maybe resin or perfume. The local official's expression becomes politely interested, which is the ancient version of pretending you're not impressed. You have a sleepy little thought. This is the first unboxing video, except the algorithm is a temple administrator and the comments section is a line of people judging your sandals. That's joke one, gentle and brief, and you let it fade like smoke. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian texts refer to distant regions with names that scholars associate with trade partners, places sometimes linked to the Persian Gulf and beyond. Archaeology suggests maritime trade routes as well as overland ones. And the evidence we do have points to goods like copper, timber, and precious stones moving through these networks. A more cautious explanation could be that not every textual place name maps neatly onto one modern location, and scholars continue to debate details. Still, the broad pattern is widely accepted. These cities are not isolated bubbles. They are connected. Now, the different origin question returns in a new shape. If earlier you felt how the city makes a person through schedules and records, now you feel how the wider world complicates that identity. One interpretation is that when outsiders arrive, merchants, migrants, emissaries, they don't just bring goods. They bring alternative ways of speaking, worshipping, measuring, and imagining. And the city must absorb or resist that difference. If you're looking for a quiet origin story, it might be here. Humanity as a braided thing, made of exchanges at gates, of intermarriage, of borrowed words, of adopted tools. Historians still argue whether the most dramatic cultural changes in early Mesopotamia are driven more by internal development or by external contacts and migrations. There's no full consensus, and you can feel why. When you look at a clay tablet, it doesn't announce, "Hello, I am the result of 60% local innovation and 40% imported ideas." It just sits there, being itself, while scholars and storytellers politely wrestle over what shaped it. You watch the travelers again. One of them looks tired, the kind of tired that settles into the bones after long days in sun and wind. Another looks alert, scanning faces the way you scan a room when you're not sure where the exit is. A child clings to a bundle, eyes wide, taking in the city as if it's a creature, walls as ribs, gates as mouth. And the cinematic what-if mood arrives, clearly labeled as imagination. What if your ancestors arrived like silhouettes at the city gate, half shadow, half dust, carrying not just objects, but possibilities? What if the origin of us is less a single birthplace and more a series of meetings, strangers becoming neighbors, then becoming family? That's gentle imagination, not a claim. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. A small commotion rises near the gate. A guard points at something. Maybe a seal impression doesn't match. Maybe a tax is disputed. Maybe someone is trying to sneak in an extra goat without declaring it. You smile, because joke 2 is unavoidable. Even here, even now, someone is arguing with customs. Human nature is a reliable artifact. The goat, for its part, looks innocent in the deeply unconvincing way goats always do. On mainstream ground, you notice the machinery of contact, seals, lists, measures, and the quiet authority of scribes. The evidence we do have points to administrative systems supporting trade by tracking goods and agreements. Archaeology suggests that standardized weights and measures develop, and that seals help verify identity and transactions. Most historians agree that these tools reduce uncertainty, at least a little, when strangers meet. And maybe that's part of what becoming human means in a city-state, learning how to trust systems enough to trade with someone you don't know. One interpretation is that stranger kings in stories, rulers with mysterious origins, outsiders who become leaders, heroes who arrive from elsewhere, might reflect the anxiety and fascination of contact. A careful reading might suggest that these narratives teach the city how to think about outsiders, sometimes as threats, sometimes as benefactors, sometimes as tests. That's interpretation, but it's a reasonable way to approach stories that repeatedly place the stranger at the center of change. Now we touch a quirky, fringe-leaning tidbit, clearly framed. A popular rumor claims that certain ancient place names, especially those associated with distant, idealized lands, refer to a lost paradise or a vanished homeland, sometimes imagined as an island or an earlier world swallowed by water. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that paradise language in texts often serves poetic or religious functions rather than geographic ones. The evidence we do have points to real trade routes and real places, even if we can't map every name with certainty. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can understand why the rumor stays alive. People love the idea that somewhere out there is a missing chapter, a place just beyond the edge of the map. You let that rumor drift away like a boat unmooring, and you return to what you can feel, the gate's wooden beams, the dust stirred by hooves, the hush-hush of clay being asked to remember. A scribe finishes a line and sets the tablet aside. Another tablet joins the stack, a small archive of movement and exchange. Joke 3 arrives softly as you imagine a merchant complaining about delays. The copper shipment is late because the river is moody, which is the ancient version of supply chain issues. Some complaints are eternal. If you listen closely, the past is always sighing, and beneath the jokes is the calm, steady idea that matters tonight. What if Sumerian records suggest a different origin of humanity by showing how identity forms at boundaries, how people become us, not only through shared rituals and city schedules, but through contact with them, through trade, through migration, through the quiet bravery of stepping through a gate into a new world and letting the city write you into its memory. You stand there a moment longer, watching silhouettes move against lantern light, and you let the image settle. Strangers arriving, the city receiving them, clay recording it all. The reeds whisper outside the walls like the same soft voice you heard at the riverbank, reminding you that the world is bigger than any city, and the story of humanity may be bigger than any single origin. You stay near the gate a little longer, because borders have a strange magnetism. There where the city admits it has an outside, there where rules get nervous. And you can feel it in the air, the dust of travel mixing with the steadier, warmer smell of baked clay and stored grain. The city behind you keeps humming its administrative lullaby. Reeds, clay, record, while the plain beyond the wall stretches out like a quiet animal at rest. A gust of wind slides in from the open land, carrying a scent you don't get inside the streets. It's raw, grass, animal fur, river mud without perfume. And for a second, the city feels like a shell, a constructed thing perched on a much older world. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature includes myths that reflect tensions between the wild and the urban, between open land and walled life, between instinct and institution. Archaeology suggests that people in this region live with both environments at once, fields and canals outside, dense neighborhoods inside. The evidence we do have points to cities depending on a wider landscape of herding, farming, and trade routes. That's the documented ground. The city is never fully separate from the wild. It just likes to pretend it is. The way someone pretends they're fine, while clearly not being fine. You drift along the wall toward a quieter corner, where the gate traffic thins and the night feels more private. There's a low platform where someone has painted or scratched a simple image, maybe a stylized animal, maybe a figure in motion. A child runs a finger along it, then darts away, leaving you with the sense that the city's stories are not only on official tablets, they're also on walls, in songs, in gestures, in the way people talk about out there. And that's where your mind, half awake and half drifting, reaches for a familiar figure from Mesopotamian storytelling, the wild man at the threshold, Most historians agree that the story of Epic of Gilgamesh develops over time in different versions and languages, and that its roots are older traditions about Gilgamesh, a kingly figure associated with Uruk. Archaeology suggests that Uruk is a real and significant city, and the evidence we do have points to a rich literary culture in later periods that preserves and reshapes earlier themes. What's broadly accepted is that these stories are not simple history, but they can reflect real concerns: power, mortality, friendship, the costs of civilization. In the tale, there is Enkidu, a figure described as living among animals, unshaped by the city, a person who belongs to the open land. A careful reading might suggest that he represents more than one thing at once: the wildness that the city fears, the freedom it envies, and the older way of life it is slowly replacing. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a common and reasonable way scholars approach this kind of character. You imagine him, not as a monster, not as a superhero, but as a human-shaped question. You picture hair full of dust, skin warmed by sun, eyes that don't flinch at open horizons, and then you picture the city noticing him, the way institutions always notice anything that doesn't fit their categories. The city is very good at noticing. It's basically built out of noticing. One interpretation is that the wild man story is about the shift from non-urban life to urban life, about how a person changes when pulled into the city's orbit. It's possible that Enkidu becomes a symbolic bridge, the threshold itself. Walking. He stands where your feet are standing now, half in the open, half in the walled. And as you listen to the night, you can hear the city's side of the argument without anyone saying it out loud. Inside, safety, food stores, rituals, names on tablets, schedules, walls. Outside, uncertainty, predators, storms, hunger, wide silence. The city claims it is civilized. The outside doesn't claim anything. It just is. Now, gently, we let the cinematic what-if mood float in, clearly framed as imagination. What if humanity is a costume you learn to wear? What if the city teaches you the costume piece by piece, a name that fits a tablet, a job that fits a ration list, a calendar that fits a festival, a way of speaking that fits a courtyard? And what if the wild man is not less human, but human in a different register, human before the costume? That's imagined mood, not fact, but it's a mood that makes the night feel slightly deeper, the way a shadow makes lamplight look warmer. You walk along the wall and imagine the moment of transformation in the story, when the wild figure is drawn into the city's world. Most historians agree that the epic includes themes of socialization and transition, and archaeology suggests that urban life requires different habits than pastoral or hunting life. The evidence we do have points to the city's dependence on order. You can't maintain canals or storerooms on vibes alone. Though, to be fair, some people have tried. Results vary. Here's joke 1. Quiet and sleepy. You imagine a city administrator meeting the wild man for the first time and immediately asking, "Do you have documentation?" The wild man stares. The administrator blinks. Somewhere, a reed stylist trembles in anticipation. This is the eternal clash of worlds. One side brings muscles and instincts. The other side brings forms. But the story isn't only about the city winning. One interpretation is that the wild man brings something the city lacks: a memory of the open world, a strength not tied to rations, a perspective not trained by walls. In the epic, friendship becomes central, and that friendship suggests a negotiation rather than a simple conquest. The city absorbs the wild, but the wild also reshapes the city, at least for one king. At least for one moment. Historians still argue whether the wild man motif primarily reflects real social transitions in early Mesopotamia, symbolic moral teaching about restraint and community, or later literary artistry layered onto older materials. There's no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of why the figure stays powerful. He's a mirror that can reflect different angles depending on what you bring to it. You pause where the wall meets a small patch of scrub outside the city. The plants are stubborn, pale, and half sleepy, clinging to the soil like they're determined to outlast every dynasty. A night insect buzzes, then stops, and you think about how myths hold tension the way a bow holds a string. They keep opposites close enough to hum. Now we touch a quirky, fringe-leaning tidbit, carefully labeled. A popular rumor claims that figures like Enkidu preserve memory of an actual other people living beyond the cities. Some lost tribe, some vanished lineage, perhaps even a non-human class in older speculative retellings. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that the character is a literary symbol built from familiar contrasts, wild and urban, nature and culture. The evidence we do have points to many groups living in different ways across the region, but not to a single hidden species hiding in the reeds. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why the rumor lingers. People want the threshold to open into something startling. Joke 2 slips in as you imagine city gossip. Did you hear? There's a man outside who doesn't know what a festival calendar is. The horror, the scandal, somewhere. A priest clutches their beads. The animals, meanwhile, remain unimpressed by human scheduling. You return to the solid ground. What's broadly accepted is that myths can encode social anxieties. Cities are proud of their order, but they are also haunted by what order costs. A careful reading might suggest that the wild man is the city's way of asking, what did we give up to become this? Freedom of movement, simplicity, the ability to live without being recorded. And perhaps the city also asks, quietly, could we ever go back? The wall answers without words. Probably not. You notice, too, that the wild man story is not simply anti-city. It doesn't say, leave everything and become a wolf. It says something more nuanced. There is power in the wild, and there is power in the city, and a human life might be shaped by how those powers meet. That fits our theme neatly. If Sumerian records and stories offer a different origin, it may be an origin of identity, humanity defined by the crossing of thresholds. Joke 3 arrives softly as you think about modern life. You can leave the city? Sure, but you still bring the city with you, your habits, your expectations, your urge to check the time. Even camping comes with spreadsheets now. Somewhere in the dark, a wild man rolls his eyes at your headlamp and your artisanal trail mix. You take one last slow look along the wall. Inside, you can almost hear the scribes, the reed styluses making that hush-hush sound on the clay. Outside, you can almost hear the land breathing, and you hold the question gently, like a small stone warmed in your hand. What if the origin of humanity in these traditions is not a single making, but a becoming urban, becoming legible, becoming someone who wears the costume of the city while still carrying a shadow of the wild? You turn back toward the streets, and the lantern light catches the dust in the air, turning it into drifting gold. The city's lullaby resumes, steady and soft, as if to say, come on, we have lists to keep. And you go, not rushing, just gliding forward. You slip back into the city's deeper lanes, and for a while you let the walls guide you the way riverbanks guide water, quietly, without explanation. The night has cooled. The heat of the day still lives inside bricks and plaster, but it's fading, exhaling slowly. A dog curls into a tighter circle. A small oil lamp trembles in a doorway, and the flame looks like it's trying to stay awake on your behalf. Above all of it, the sky feels closer than it did by the river. Maybe it's because the alleys frame it into narrow strips. Maybe it's because your mind is already half drifting, and stars always seem more intimate when you're tired. You stop in a courtyard where someone has placed a low stool and a shallow bowl of water that reflects the heavens in a shaky, upside-down version of itself. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian scholars developed sophisticated traditions of observing the sky, tracking celestial patterns, and interpreting omens over long periods. Archaeology suggests that clay tablets preserve extensive records of celestial observations and omen interpretations, and the evidence we do have points to this being a serious intellectual craft, not a casual hobby. The sky is not just scenery here. It's information. You can feel how natural that is in a world where so much is uncertain. Rivers flood. Crops fail. Illness arrives without warning. Politics shifts like sand. A careful reading might suggest that people look up, not because they think the stars are magic, but because the stars are dependable in a way daily life isn't. If your ground keeps surprising you, you learn to love anything that repeats. You notice a small group gathered near the courtyard wall. Not a crowd, just a few figures in calm conversation. One of them holds a tablet. One holds a stylus. Someone gestures upward with 2 fingers, tracing a line across the sky as if the air itself could be scored like clay. The motif returns again. Reeds, clay, record. Except tonight it's paired with starlight. What's broadly accepted is that omen interpretation in Mesopotamian tradition can cover many domains: the behavior of animals, unusual births, weather patterns, and especially celestial events. The evidence we do have points to compiled omen series and records that link specific signs to potential outcomes. Let me rephrase that more carefully. These outcomes are part of a worldview, not a modern predictive science, and the meaning of prediction varies with context. But it's possible that omen systems function as a structured way to manage anxiety, an organized language for uncertainty, and you can feel that, can't you? The calm appeal of a system that says, if this happens, then that might follow. It doesn't make the world less dangerous, but it makes it more legible. It gives your fear a grammar. One interpretation is that the heavens become a kind of public notebook, not because the stars are literally writing messages, but because the human mind can't help making patterns. A careful reading might suggest that when scholars catalog eclipses, unusual planets, or strange atmospheric effects, they are building a database of meaning. The evidence we do have points to careful observation being valued. And in a city built on record-keeping, it makes sense that the sky would be pulled into the same habit. Notice, classify, compare, record. Here's your first light joke for the section. Drifting in gently. You imagine a scribe looking up at a comet and immediately thinking, great, now I have to file this. Somewhere, an administrator sighs into their hands. Because the universe refuses to stop producing new paperwork, you move closer, and the group's conversation stays quiet, the way people talk when they're working with something delicate. A stylus taps the clay softly. Tap. Press. Lift, like a slow heartbeat. You can almost picture the logic. A planet appears brighter than usual. Someone notes it. Someone checks older notes. Someone suggests a meaning. Someone writes the association down as a possibility. None of it requires a hidden secret. It requires patience. Historians still argue whether these astronomical omen traditions are primarily religious in purpose, primarily political tools used by courts, or primarily scholarly attempts to systematize observation that later take on ritual meaning. There's no full consensus, and it's likely that the balance shifts across time and place. But what's broadly accepted is that trained specialists exist, and that the sky becomes a subject of expertise. Now, we let the cinematic what-if mood arrive, clearly framed as imagination. What if the origin story isn't only pressed into mud, but also projected above you every night? What if the story is pointing at something else, like the idea that humans become human not just by organizing cities, but by turning the cosmos into a readable space? Not because the cosmos is literally speaking, but because the act of reading it trains your mind into a certain posture. Attentive, interpretive, always looking for signals, looking for, that's gentle imagination. Not a claim. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You tilt your head back and stare at the stars until your neck complains softly, which is your body's way of saying, yes, yes, the cosmos is lovely, but please remember you are made of joints. You see the pale smear of the Milky Way like spilled flour across dark cloth. You can sense how easy it is to believe it means something, especially when you're tired, especially when your city depends on harvests and canal flow and political stability. One interpretation is that omen reading is a form of responsibility. If you're a ruler, you want to know what's coming. If you're a temple, you want to maintain order. If you're a scholar, you want to connect present events to past records. And if you're just a person trying to sleep, you want reassurance that the world is not random. A more cautious explanation could be that these systems offer comfort even when they aren't true in a modern sense. They make uncertainty feel negotiated rather than helpless. Now we touch a quirky, fringe-leaning tidbit, clearly framed. A popular rumor claims that ancient sky records contain warnings about catastrophic cycles, hidden schedules of world resets, coded into lists of eclipses and planetary movements. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that compiled omen texts, like Enuma Anu Enlil, are best understood as traditional associations collected over time rather than secret calendars of doom. The evidence we do have points to interpretive frameworks that respond to uncertainty, not to guaranteed forecasts. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can understand why the rumor thrives. People love the idea that the sky is an instruction manual with a dramatic plot twist. Second joke. Soft and short. You imagine someone in the courtyard squinting at the stars and saying, "That one looks angry," and someone else replying, "No, that's just the planet doing planet stuff." The planet, naturally, refuses to comment. Your attention returns to the tablet. The marks are small, neat, controlled. You realize that the same impulse that produces ration lists can also produce star lists. The city wants to measure. It wants to predict. It wants to be less surprised. In that way, the sky becomes an extension of the city's administrative soul, beautiful, distant, and somehow still subject to note-taking. Most historians agree that later Mesopotamian scholarship, especially in places like Babylon, preserves and develops these observational traditions in increasingly technical ways. Archaeology suggests long textual lineages where ideas are copied, refined, and debated. The evidence we do have points to continuity, a long conversation across generations, held together by clay. Let me rephrase that more carefully. When we speak about Sumerian records and later Mesopotamian science, we're spanning time and cultural change, and details can shift. That's a possibility, not a certainty in every case. But the broader pattern, sky observation taken seriously, recorded carefully, is well supported. Third joke arrives like a yawn. You imagine a scholar staring at the sky for hours, then going home and telling their family. Work was intense, and the family replying, "You literally watch stars," and the scholar saying, "Yes," and they were extremely consistent, which is more than I can say for you people. Domestic life, like the heavens, has its own predictable cycles. You stand there a little longer, letting the courtyard settle into quiet. The bowl of water reflects the stars, then blurs when a breeze touches it, reminding you how easily signs can be disturbed by something as simple as air, and you hold the thought gently. Maybe the different origin hinted at in these records isn't a single moment of creation, but the moment humans begin to treat the world, city, river, sky, as something that can be read. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And tonight, as you walk away from the courtyard, you carry the soft, steady feeling that the sky above you is not only a ceiling, it's a companion to the clay below you, both asking the same quiet question: what patterns can you live by when you can't control what comes next? You keep drifting through the sleeping city, and now the sky feels like it's following you, thin slices of stars above alley roofs, a bright point here and there slipping between beams as you move. The courtyard scholars are behind you, but their quiet posture stays with you, the posture of someone looking for meaning without grabbing too hard. Ahead, you hear a different kind of sound, a low murmur of storytelling, not the busy talk of commerce, not the sharp voice of an official, but something softer, voices gathered in a courtyard where a lamp is shielded from wind. And the night has settled into that cozy density that makes people want to speak in longer sentences. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian societies preserve myths and epics that vary by city, era, and political needs. And archaeology suggests that these texts are copied, taught, and reworked over long spans. The evidence we do have points to multiple creation traditions rather than one single, uniform story. What's broadly accepted is that when a society tells an origin story, it's rarely only about how the world began. It's also about how the world should be understood right now. You slip closer, so not intruding, just hovering at the edge like a sleepy cat pretending it doesn't care. Someone is reciting a familiar rhythm, lines that sound like they've been spoken many times before. You can't pin down the words, but you can sense the structure. The world begins in a certain way. Gods arrange things. Humans appear with a purpose. The city has a place in the cosmic order. The tone is calm but firm, like a lullaby that also doubles as an instruction manual. One interpretation is that creation stories function as political comfort. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not political in a modern party sense, but in the sense of power and order. It's possible that these stories reassure people that the hierarchy they live under has roots deeper than any single ruler. If the gods made the world a certain way, then the city's structure can feel inevitable, even comforting. The evidence we do have points to myths being used in ritual contexts and courtly settings, where legitimacy matters. You notice how origin stories can solve an anxiety without ever mentioning it. People worry about chaos, floods, rival cities, crop failure. A story that says, the cosmos is arranged, and you have a role, is a warm blanket over those fears. And if you're listening right now, you know how powerful a warm blanket is. It's basically a small miracle. What's broadly accepted is that different Mesopotamian texts emphasize different things. Some center on cosmic battles and divine ordering. Some focus on the founding of cities and temples. Some treat humans as servants of the gods, maintaining rituals and providing offerings. A careful reading might suggest that each version reflects the concerns of its setting. A temple might prefer a story that emphasizes sacred duty. A palace might prefer a story that emphasizes kingship and order. A city might prefer a story that places its own patron deity at the center. That's interpretation, but it's reasonable interpretation. Stories tend to flatter the storyteller. Now, in the spirit of our theme, you hold the different origin question up to these narratives. What if the origin of humanity here is not a single biological beginning, but a social assignment? Humans appear in the stories with jobs: cultivate, build, serve, maintain. One interpretation is that these myths encode the logic of institutions. They make labor feel cosmic. That's not a cynical claim that religion is fake. It's a cautious observation that myth can carry multiple functions at once: spiritual meaning and social order, layered like plaster on brick. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian creation stories should be read primarily as theology, as political ideology, as reflections of environmental realities, or as literary art that can't be reduced to one function. There's no full consensus, and you can feel why. A story can be many things at once. A story can be sincere and strategic. A story can be a prayer and a policy. Here comes your first light joke. You imagine an ancient storyteller finishing a grand creation account, and someone in the audience raising a hand like it's a classroom and asking, "So, where do taxes fit in?" And the storyteller, without missing a beat, says, "The gods love order." The audience nods, because everyone knows what that means. Even the lamp flame looks resigned. Now we let the cinematic what-if mood roll in, clearly labeled as imagination. What if the origin is simply whoever gets to narrate? What if humanity's beginning changes depending on which courtyard you're standing in, which city's lamp you're under, which institution is paying the storyteller's dinner? That's gentle imagination, but it's rooted in a mainstream reality. Texts vary, traditions compete, and power influences what gets copied. You feel the tension between stone and mist. Documented. Myths exist in multiple forms and change over time. Interpreted, they offer comfort and legitimacy. Imagined, each telling subtly remakes humanity's origin like a lullaby with different verses. Someone passes you a cup, maybe water, maybe something fermented enough to make the stars look friendlier. You don't drink much. Tonight is about drowsy clarity. You listen. The storyteller's voice rises at certain points, then softens. People lean in. A child's head droops against a shoulder. A dog sighs, and you realize origin stories are also sleep technology. They gather the group, they steady breathing, they remind everyone that the world has a shape. Even if the shape is debated, the act of shaping is soothing. Now we touch a quirky fringe tidbit, carefully framed. A popular rumor claims that certain creation accounts hide a true origin story behind layers of later editing, an earlier secret version suppressed by priests or kings. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that variation and redaction happen naturally as texts are copied, translated, and adapted across centuries, with no single hidden plot required. The evidence we do have points to scribal culture being dynamic. Copying includes changes, commentary, and sometimes deliberate reshaping. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can still let the rumor hover as a mood. The sense that stories carry older ghosts beneath newer paint. Second joke. Soft and quick. You imagine those older ghosts complaining like tenants in an apartment building. "Excuse me, we were the original draft." And the newer version replying, "Yes, and you had terrible pacing." Somewhere, A scribe quietly edits both. You let your mind return to the most grounded idea of the night. Origin stories don't only tell where people came from, they tell who people are for. That's a broad, mainstream, safe observation. The evidence we do have points to many ancient societies using myth to define duties, values, and social roles. In Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian contexts, humans are often positioned in relationship to gods, cities, and the maintenance of order. One interpretation is that humanity is defined by service and responsibility, keeping rituals, sustaining institutions, feeding the divine through offerings and praise. Let me rephrase that more carefully. That doesn't mean individuals felt nothing but duty. People loved, joked, argued, and dreamed. But it's possible that official stories emphasize social order because social order is fragile, especially beside unpredictable rivers. Third joke arrives like a slow blink. You imagine the gods listening to offerings and thinking, "Ah, yes, my favorite, administrative stability." It's funny because it's half true in a symbolic sense. In these stories, gods often represent order itself. So maybe what people are really feeding is the idea that life can be arranged. You sit with that thought as the courtyard grows quieter. The storyteller's voice slows. The lamp's flame shrinks. Someone adjusts a blanket, and you let the different origin question settle into a calm shape. What if Sumerian records and stories point to humanity's origin not as a single hidden truth, but as an ongoing negotiation between fear and comfort, chaos and order, labor and meaning, told and retold until it feels like reality? Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and as you drift away from the courtyard, the city's lullaby resumes. Reeds, clay, record, now joined by the soft echo of voices that have been shaping where we came from into how we live for a very long time. You leave the courtyard behind, but the storyteller's cadence follows you like a slow drumbeat under your ribs. The city has quieted into that late-night hush where even arguments sound tired. A lamp in a doorway trembles, then steadies. Somewhere, a reed mat shifts as someone turns in sleep. And through it all, you can almost hear the soft scratch of a stylus again, the hush-hush sound of clay taking a mark, as if the city can't fully rest until it has written down the day. You walk toward a workshop area where kilns once breathed heat into the night. The air here smells faintly of smoke and baked earth, and you realize, sleepily, how often you've been guided by this one material: clay. Clay underfoot, clay in the walls, clay in bowls, clay in tablets. It's as if the land is insisting, gently, remember what you're made of. Most historians agree that many Mesopotamian myths describe humans being formed from clay. Archaeology suggests that clay is the everyday substance of life in the alluvial plain, and the evidence we do have points to its centrality. Mud brick architecture, pottery, seals, tablets. What's broadly accepted is that clay in these stories is not random. It's the stuff people touch daily. It's the element that bridges nature and craft. And now the different origin question leans closer to the ground, almost literally. If humans are made of clay in the myths, what does that mean? One interpretation is that clay is a metaphor for belonging. A careful reading might suggest that saying humans are made of clay ties people to place, to the river plain, to the earth that feeds them. It's possible that the story is less about anatomy and more about identity. You belong here. You are from this soil. You are part of this landscape, and the landscape will reclaim you. That's interpretation, not certainty. But it's a gentle, mainstream safe way to think about a repeated motif. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We shouldn't assume every clay creation story means the same thing in every context. Texts vary, and later traditions adapt earlier themes. Scholars continue to debate nuances. What clay signals? What breath signals? What blood or divine essence might signal in different versions? If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. But the broad pattern is widely recognized. Clay is central. You stop beside a low stack of dried bricks, and you run your fingers along the surface. It's rough and warm, holding a little heat from the day. You imagine a potter's hands shaping wet earth into form, then setting it to dry, then firing it to make it durable. The process is quiet, repetitive, and strangely intimate. In a city where so much is recorded, the act of shaping clay feels like the simplest kind of certainty. Now the interpretation angle deepens, still cautious. One interpretation is that clay-made humans reflects a society where labor is the defining feature of personhood. Clay is worked, clay is shaped, clay becomes useful through effort. A careful reading might suggest the myth is saying, in metaphor, that humans are the worked material of civilization, formed into roles, fired into obligations, stacked into institutions. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it resonates with what archaeology suggests about organized labor and administrative life. You can feel how neatly it fits our earlier motifs. The city shapes you, like clay. The temple assigns you, like clay. The scribe records you, like clay. And then the myth turns around and says, yes, that's what you are, shaped earth. Here comes your first light joke, soft and sleepy. You imagine an ancient person hearing, you are made of clay, and replying, that explains why I feel heavy in the morning. The myth, for its part, nods like it's been waiting for you to catch up. Now we let the cinematic what-if mood roll in, clearly labeled as imagination. What if clay is not just a metaphor for material, but a hint about belonging and control? What if the story is pointing at something else, like the idea that whoever controls the clay controls the human? Because clay is everywhere, and it's cheap, and it's moldable. What if the myth is a lullaby for a society built on shaping bricks, shaping pots, shaping people? That's gentle imagination, not a documented claim. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You glance up and see the moon, pale and slightly smug, as if it knows it has been used in 1,000 stories. Under that light, the city looks like it grew out of the ground naturally, even though you know, mainstream fact, that it took endless labor to make and maintain. Archaeology suggests repeated rebuilding layers. In the evidence we do have points to cities rising as floors are resurfaced and walls collapse and are replaced. The city is a mound because people keep stacking clay on clay. What's broadly accepted is that myths about making humans often involve a second ingredient besides clay: breath, spirit, divine spark. Sometimes the blood of a god in later Mesopotamian traditions. These details vary, and scholars continue to debate the relationships between different texts. But the pattern is clear enough. Clay provides form, and something else provides life. That duality is old and compelling. Body and spirit, material and meaning. One interpretation is that the breath element in these stories reflects the idea that life is a gift, not purely mechanical. A careful reading might suggest it's also a way of explaining consciousness and social order. Humans are not just bodies. They are beings who can participate in ritual. Speak, obey, remember. That's interpretation. but it's a gentle one that fits many ancient world views. Historians still argue whether clay creation myths should be read primarily as reflections of everyday craft, pottery and brickmaking, as social ideology about labor and hierarchy, or as theological statements about the relationship between gods and humans. There's no full consensus, and that's comforting in a way. It means the story has layers, like the city itself. Now we touch a quirky, fringe-leaning tidbit, carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that clay is a coded reference to some kind of engineered creation, humans manufactured through unknown processes, with myths preserving distorted memory of technology. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that clay is simply the most immediate and symbolically rich material in the Mesopotamian environment. The evidence we do have points to metaphor and craft being powerful sources for myth. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why the idea persists. Humans love to imagine that the oldest metaphors are encrypted blueprints. Second joke. Quiet and quick. You imagine someone asking the gods, "If we're made of clay, can you at least fire us properly so we don't crack under pressure?" The gods, in myth, are famously selective about customer service. You keep walking, and the city's surfaces feel more alive now that you're thinking in clay. Every wall is a reminder of shaping. Every bowl is a reminder of hands. Every tablet is a reminder of memory pressed into earth. And the different origin question becomes less about secrets and more about perspective. Perhaps Sumerian records and stories suggest that humanity begins when people start to see themselves as crafted, formed by place, by labor, by institutions, by rituals, by language. Third joke arrives like a drowsy grin. You realize clay is also the ultimate low-maintenance material. It's everywhere. It's free, and it doesn't require a user manual. Modern products could never. You pause near a small pile of discarded sherds, broken pottery pieces that glitter faintly in the moonlight. The broken edges are sharp but quiet. You think about how fragile crafted things are, and yet how long they last when buried. That's part of the mystery. The most ordinary objects become the loudest voices across time. Some parts are documented. Some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And tonight, as you step forward, you let the clay story settle over you like a blanket. In Sumer, to say we are made of clay might mean we belong to this earth. We are shaped by work, and we can be remade again and again whenever the city needs to rebuild its world. You keep moving through the city as if you're floating a few inches above the dust, and the streets feel softer now, less like corridors and more like a slow current. The clay underfoot is still warm in places, holding the day's heat the way a brick holds a memory. Somewhere nearby, you hear that familiar hush-hush sound again, a stylus pressing into wet earth, and the motif returns like a lullaby you didn't realize you'd learned. Reeds, clay, record. The night air smells faintly of smoke and dried reeds. And for a moment you remember the gate, the riverbank, the courtyard under stars, the storyteller's voice, the clay bricks under your fingers. All these scenes are separate, and yet the city ties them together in one long thread, like a cord braided from labor, ritual, and careful attention. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian cultures develop rich traditions of protective figures, ritual objects, and mythic wise beings over time. And archaeology suggests that people place protective items in buildings, foundations, and thresholds as part of keeping disorder out. The evidence we do have points to a world where unseen forces are taken seriously. Not as a spooky gimmick, but as part of how people explain risk and safety. When your walls are mud brick and your rivers are moody, you learn to respect anything that promises protection. You arrive near a doorway where a small niche holds a cluster of figurines or little sculpted forms. Half hidden in shadow, they're not big or dramatic, but they carry a quiet authority, as if the house is politely insisting, "We have security." Archaeology suggests that apotropaic practices exist in Mesopotamia, including figurines and inscriptions used to ward off harm. What's broadly accepted is that such practices reflect a desire to manage uncertainty with ritual. In the same way you might lock a door and also hope for the best. And then, in the soft circle of lamplight, you notice an image that feels stranger than a simple guardian. A figure with a fish-like cloak, or a feathered outline, or a stylized, otherworldly posture. You don't grab it as proof of anything. You just notice it. This is where later Mesopotamian traditions speak of wise sages, sometimes called apkallu in some sources, figures associated with knowledge, order, and protection. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The term and its best-known imagery are often tied to later periods and languages, and scholars continue to debate how these traditions relate to earlier Sumerian material. The evidence we do have points to continuity and adaptations across centuries, not a single fixed concept. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Still, the idea is steady enough to hold gently. A set of lesson bringers, figures imagined as transmitters of craft, ritual, and civilization, not necessarily aliens, not necessarily literal historical people, but a cultural way of personifying knowledge. The way you might personify wisdom as an old teacher with kind eyes. One interpretation is that these sages represent the memory of learning itself, a story form for the slow accumulation of skills that make cities possible. You stand there, and your mind does what it always does in the dark. It turns shapes into stories. What's broadly accepted is that early Mesopotamian life depends on specialized knowledge. Canal digging, brick making, accounting, brewing, weaving, medicine, ritual timing, and the careful reading of omens. The evidence we do have points to expertise being valuable. So it makes sense that cultures imagine first teachers who bring knowledge into the world. A careful reading might suggest that when a society can't point to one inventor of irrigation or writing, it creates a symbolic lineage of instruction. That's interpretation, but it's a reasonable interpretation, and it stays on mainstream ground. Now the cinematic what-if mood arrives, clearly framed as imagination. What if the teachers are memories dressed in feathers? What if those fish-cloaked, winged, or otherwise strange figures are not literal beings, but the city's own way of saying, "We were taught," without needing to name every anonymous laborer, every forgotten craftsperson, every patient scribe who copied a list one more time until it became tradition. That's gentle imagination, not a claim. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Here comes joke 1. Light as a breath. You imagine a sage showing up wearing a fish cloak and announcing, "Today's lesson is canal maintenance." And the students whispering, "Is this the dress code now?" Somewhere in the corner, a very serious administrator nods and says, "If it improves compliance, yes." You drift along the wall and notice small marks. Maybe an old impression, maybe a faded relief, maybe a symbol painted and repainted. The city is full of layers, and protective imagery is one more layer of reassurance. One interpretation is that these figures do double duty. They guard the household, and they guard the idea of knowledge itself. Because if knowledge is what keeps the city alive, then knowledge feels sacred. It feels like something you should protect. Historians still argue whether these sage traditions are best understood as purely mythic symbols, as reflections of priestly lineages and scribal schools, or as echoes of real cultural contacts and inherited practices that later get mythologized. There's no full consensus, and you can feel why. A symbol can be a symbol and still be rooted in something real, like how a bedtime story can be imaginary and still teach you what to do when you're scared. You pass a small work area where someone has left tools in a neat arrangement. Even in sleepiness, you recognize the quiet pride in that. Tools laid out, ready for morning. The evidence we do have points to organized crafts and long traditions of training. Apprentices learn from masters. Children learn by watching. Scribes learn by copying. Knowledge is not lightning, it's repetition. And repetition is exactly what clay loves. Press. Lift. Press. Joke 2 slips in softly. You imagine the ancient version of a training seminar. The sage says, "Welcome, everyone." And the apprentices groan because they know it means another 8 hours of practice wedges. The sage smiles and says, "This is how civilizations are built." The apprentices reply, "We were hoping for snacks." Now we touch a fringe tidbit, clearly framed. A fringe idea proposes that the wise sage's tradition preserves memory of literal non-human instructors who arrived in the distant past and taught humans writing, agriculture, and governance. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians agree that mythic teacher figures are common across cultures because they elegantly explain gradual developments in a story-friendly way. A more cautious explanation could be that these sages personify institutions, inherited techniques, and the prestige of specialized knowledge. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can see why people find it compelling. It turns the slow grind of learning into a dramatic arrival scene at the edge of the world. You let that fringe possibility hover in the mist, then return to the solid ground beneath your feet. The evidence we do have points to humans teaching humans, generation after generation, and to stories forming around that teaching. And honestly, that's already magical in the non-spooky sense. The ability to pass knowledge forward, intact enough to build a city, is one of the strangest and most beautiful things humans do. You pause near a doorway again, and you notice a small carved symbol, a protective mark, or maybe just decoration. Either way, it signals care. Someone wanted this threshold to be safe. Someone wanted to feel watched over. One interpretation is that watchers, in a broad, non-literal sense, are simply the idea that order has eyes, that the world is not indifferent, that your home, your work, your city, your family are seen. Let me rephrase that more carefully. We should be cautious with the word watchers, because later folklore and modern retellings sometimes load it with meanings that don't belong to these contexts. That's a possibility, not a certainty. To be clear, this is debated. But it's possible that protective spirits and sage figures are a way of making responsibility feel present, as if wisdom stands at the door with you, steady and quiet. Joke 3 arrives gently as you imagine a protective figurine doing its job all night. You think, that little guardian has been on duty for centuries, and you realize it deserves paid time off and a tiny mug that says, "World's Best Apotropaic Entity." The figurine, of course, remains professionally silent. You take a slow breath, and the city seems to breathe back. Reeds whisper somewhere outside the walls. Clay holds the day's warmth, records dry on shelves. And in the middle of it, the idea of teachers, sages, and protective presences feels less like a wild secret and more like a human habit, turning knowledge into a character, turning safety into an image. turning uncertainty into something you can place at a threshold. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and tonight, as you continue forward, you carry a calm possibility. What if the different origin suggested by these traditions is not that humans were made by strangers, but that humans were shaped by learning, guarded by ritual, and remembered through figures that stand at the door of history, like quiet teachers in feathered cloaks? You keep gliding forward, and the city feels like it's settling deeper into sleep, as if each street is exhaling. The lamps burn lower, the voices become fewer and softer. Even the dogs seem to have surrendered to the idea that nothing important is happening until morning, which is a wise attitude. Honestly, you pass a low wall and catch the scent of damp reeds again, your motif returning like a friendly hand on your shoulder. Reeds, clay, record. The city's lullaby is so consistent that you could almost set your breathing to it, and as you move, you begin to notice something that's been true all along. The story you're following is not a straight road, it's a braid. Facts, interpretations, imagination, solid ground, mist, a puzzle, an open question, a debated interpretation. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian literature blends myth, ideology, and historical memory in ways that don't fit modern categories neatly. Archaeology suggests that texts are copied, edited, and adapted across long spans. And the evidence we do have points to variation, multiple versions of stories, different emphases, and contradictions that sometimes sit side by side without apology. What's broadly accepted is that ancient scribes are not merely photocopiers. They are participants in tradition. You stop near a small scribal space. Quiet now, but you can see where someone sits in daylight. A tablet rests on a shelf, drying. The surface catches the lamp glow and looks almost soft again, as if the clay is still willing to change its mind. And you think about how a contradiction can be like that. Still wet, still malleable, still resisting finality. Now, as promised, we step into the heart of the section's debate phrase. And we do it exactly and clearly. Historians still argue whether the contradictions in Mesopotamian origin narratives reflect competing local traditions, deliberate political reshaping, or simply the natural messiness of stories carried across centuries. There it is, quiet but important. Because once you accept that contradictions might be meaningful, the entire different origin question changes. It stops being about finding one hidden version behind the others. It becomes about understanding why multiple versions can exist at all. One interpretation is that contradictions are not always errors. A careful reading might suggest they are fingerprints of cultural diversity. Different cities have different patron gods. Different temples have different ritual priorities. Different courts have different political needs. So it's possible that a creation story shifts not because someone is lying, but because someone is speaking from a different center. The evidence we do have points to city-state identities being strong, and stories often serve identity. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not every contradiction is intentional, and some differences can arise from copying, translation, and the simple reality that scribes are human. That's a possibility, not a certainty. But it's plausible that at least some variation reflects genuine plurality rather than a single official canon. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. You walk again, and the streets feel like pages turning beneath your feet. You think about the way a myth can carry different meanings for different listeners. A farmer might hear a creation story and think about harvest and flood. A priest might hear it and think about ritual order. A king might hear it and think about legitimacy. A tired laborer might hear it and think, please, can the gods create a day off? The myth doesn't argue. It absorbs. Here comes your first light joke, gentle and sleepy. You imagine two scribes debating which version to copy, and one says, this one has better pacing, while the other says, yes, but this one flatters the temple. And then they both compromise by copying both. Because bureaucracy loves redundancy almost as much as it loves authority. Now, we bring in the interpretation angle promised by the outline. Contradictions revealing competing traditions rather than deception. One interpretation is that this competition itself is part of the origin story. Not in the mythic sense, but in the cultural sense. Humanity's beginning is narrated differently depending on who is speaking. The city makes people legible. Yes, but the city also makes stories contestable. And maybe that contest is the real clue. What if the story is pointing at something else? Like the reality that origins are tools, not fossils. They are used. That remains interpretation, not certainty. Now we allow the cinematic what-if mood to settle in, clearly framed as imagination. What if the gaps are the point? Spaces where you can't confirm, only wonder. What if the clay itself, so humble and so patient, is telling you to accept unfinished edges? Not everything gets fired into permanence. Some stories stay soft, because they need to fit many hands. That's gentle imagination. Not a claim. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You pass a corner where someone has left a broken tablet fragment. Just a piece, not the whole. It's common in archaeology. Fragments, partial lines, missing endings. The evidence we do have points to incomplete preservation being the norm, not the exception. And that physical reality becomes a metaphor almost too perfect. The past reaches you in shards. You reconstruct. You guess carefully. You mark your guesses as guesses. You do your best. Second joke. Soft and quick. You imagine an ancient scribe dropping a tablet and saying, "It's fine. It'll be an artifact someday." And their co-worker replying, "Yes, but right now it's my problem." The future thanks them for their clumsiness. The present does not. Now we touch a fringe tidbit, clearly framed, because contradictions are where fringe interpretations like to set up camp. A fringe idea proposes that contradictions in origin stories prove deliberate concealment, that one group hid the real origin while leaving clues behind. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that plural traditions, political shifts, and scribal variation naturally produce differences without a single secret plan. The evidence we do have points to complexity and change rather than to one hidden script. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can still understand the emotional appeal. People want certainty, and secrets feel like certainty dressed up in drama. You let that fringe possibility drift into the mist, and you return to the steadier ground. Uncertainty can be honest. Contradictions can be informative. A careful reading might suggest that the different origin is not one alternative story, but the very fact of alternatives. Humanity's beginning. In these records is not a single door, it's a hallway with many rooms, each lit by a different lamp. Third joke arrives like a slow smile. You imagine trying to ask the city itself for the official version, and the city replying, "Please submit your question in triplicate." Then it hands you a reed stylus. Then it points you to a line that never ends. Even your confusion becomes administrative. You stop again and listen. The night is quieter now, and you can hear the faintest sounds, a distant drip, a sleepy sigh, a reed mat settling. The city feels ancient and tender, not just powerful. And you remember our truth ladder, woven gently, documented. Texts vary and blend genres. Interpreted, contradictions can reflect competing traditions. Imagined, the gaps invite wonder. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. So, in this calm, drowsy moment, you hold a final thought for the section. What if the different origin that Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian records offer is not a replacement for mainstream history, but a reminder that beginnings are negotiated? That people have always argued over what counts as true, what counts as useful, what counts as ours. And the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially when the clay is broken. The lines are missing, and the lamps are burning low. You keep walking, not toward an answer, but toward a softer kind of understanding, that the past can be plural and still be real. You keep moving, and the city feels like it's thinning into pure quiet, the way a song fades until it's mostly memory. The lamps are fewer now. The streets are emptier. Your footsteps sound softer, as if even the dust is trying not to wake anyone. Somewhere beyond the walls, the reeds still whisper, the same gentle sound you began with, and it ties the whole night together like a loose thread you can follow with sleepy fingers. Reeds, clay, record. Most historians agree that Mesopotamia, especially the Sumerian city-states of the south, shapes later ideas about cities, writing, law, and sacred kingship across the region. Archaeology suggests that many of the patterns you've been walking through tonight, administration, temple organization, specialized labor, long textual traditions, become foundational for later cultures. The evidence we do have points to influence and continuity, even as languages change and power shifts north and south. That's the solid ground, steady and unromantic, like a well-packed road. And now you gather everything you've seen tonight, not into one hidden truth, but into a calm mosaic. Because there's no full consensus on every detail, and we don't need one. We're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. On the documented side, you've walked through what's broadly accepted. Rivers nourish cities. Cities require coordination. Writing begins in practical records. Temples anchor identity and economy. Floods happen and leave layers. Trade connects far places. Myths reflect social tensions. Sky observation becomes a serious craft. Stories vary and evolve across time. None of that needs a secret subplot to be fascinating. The everyday is already strange when you look closely. On the interpreted side, you've tried on a careful possibility. Maybe human origin in these records. This is less about biology and more about becoming urban, becoming legible, becoming the kind of creature who trusts marks on clay, who organizes time into calendars, who accepts roles and rations, who lives inside an order that feels cosmic because it's shared by everyone around you. One interpretation is that the origin story is not one event. It's a slow training of attention, duty, and identity. Humanity is a pattern learned and relearned. And on the imagined side, the mist you kept labeled, you've let yourself hover in cinematic scenes, silhouettes at gates, divine names as masks, floodwater erasing ledgers, sages dressed in feathers, the sky as a quiet script above the city. These images are not proof. They're mood. They're how the mind explores what it can't confirm without pretending it can. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Historians still argue whether the biggest turning points in early Mesopotamian life are driven more by environment, by institutions, by migration, by ideology, or by a mix that shifts from place to place and century to century. There's no full consensus, and that's part of the beauty. The past is not one straight line. It's a braided river. Now we touch one last fringe tidbit, carefully framed, because it has been hovering at the edges all night like a moth near a lamp. A fringe idea proposes that behind the Sumerian record, behind the long reigns, the sage figures, the divine language, there is a literal alternative origin. Non-human teachers, engineered humans, suppressed truths. This theory isn't widely accepted, and a more cautious explanation could be that symbolic storytelling, political legitimacy, scribal tradition, and the human love of grand numbers can account for much of what seems mysterious. The evidence we do have points to real people building real cities with real tools. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can still use it the way a dream uses an image, to ask better questions, not to lock in answers. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Because endings can make people careless, it's tempting to want a single, dramatic solution, one secret origin story to replace all others. But the safer, truer feeling of these records is plural. Many beginnings, many purposes, many voices, a mosaic of documented stones with interpreted patterns and imagined mortar. Here's a final light joke before we drift into the wind down. If you ever feel like your own life story is messy, remember, the ancient city is literally made of mud, and it still manages to create writing, astronomy, and epic poetry. So, yes, you can absolutely be a little messy and still be impressive. The mud brick has spoken, and now, as promised, the pacing softens, the vocabulary loosens, the sentences stretch out and slow down, the way your breathing stretches out when you finally stop trying to solve anything. You wander back toward the riverbank, or maybe you only imagine you do, because the mind can travel without moving, and that's one of its gentlest talents. The air cools, the reeds whisper again, the water carries moonlight in broken pieces. Somewhere in the city behind you, a tablet dries on a shelf, the clay slowly stiffening, holding marks that once were soft enough to change. You let your shoulders drop. You let your jaw unclench. You let your thoughts stop gripping the question so tightly. Most historians agree that the people of ancient Sumer lived close to forces larger than themselves. Rivers, seasons, the demands of cities, the weight of tradition. Archaeology suggests they adapted with remarkable creativity. Canals, walls, rituals, records, stories that could carry meaning across generations. And you can rest in that. Whatever you believe about origins, you can appreciate the human habit of trying to understand. The quiet courage of looking at a vast world and saying, let's make a mark, let's remember. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And in the mist, tonight, you don't need certainty. You only need the feeling of continuity. Reeds, clay, record. Like a lullaby that doesn't demand you stay awake. You listen to the water. You imagine the scribe's stylus pressing into clay with a slow, steady rhythm. Tap, press, lift, tap, press, lift. You imagine the city breathing in sleep behind its walls. You imagine the stars above, quiet and patient, watching without judgment. And in that calm, you let the idea of origin become something softer than a fact you must defend. Something like a story you can hold gently. Then set down. Something like a pebble warmed in your palm, Then return to the riverbank. Your eyelids feel heavier now. The night feels kind. The world, for once, does not ask you to solve it. You are allowed to drift. You are allowed to rest. And as the reeds whisper and the water carries its slow, ancient hush, you let the last image fade into darkness, like a candle lowering itself into quiet. End of script. Sweet dreams.